When speaking on the virtue of hope, St. Thomas Aquinas explains it's always grounded in a desire for a good. This means that there may be a good missing in our life, so we hope for the type of good that we're missing. And there's two types of goods that he would explain we could be missing. The first is natural, and the second is divine. When it comes to the theological virtue of hope, we're particularly focusing on the divine good, which is communion or union with God himself. As we wrap up our reflection on the theological virtues, particularly on hope today, what I'd like to do is offer a bit of a reflection on Spe Salve, a document that Pope Benedict wrote particularly on the virtue of faith. In it, he emphasizes the connection between faith, hope, and love, and he tells us an important story. One of the stories he speaks about is Saint Bakita, an African woman who was canonized by Saint John Paul II. Saint Bakita, as a child, was kidnapped and beaten and sold into slavery as a child. She had 5 masters, some of whom would whip her and flog her every single day until she bled. At the end of her life, she had 144 scars on her body, testifying to the cruelty of her masters who sought to break her spirit and keep her chained in fear. When Saint Bakita finally found freedom in Italy, she encountered a new master, a master whom she would fall in love with. This master, of course, was Jesus Christ, a very different type of master. Jesus did not coercively and against her will take her into his service, but rather invited her freely of her own accord. And Jesus was willing to be flogged for her sake, rather than asking her to be flogged out of cruelty for his. Saint Bakita learned in this moment of encounter with Christ that there is an even greater emancipation that goes beyond political freedom and liberty, but it's an emancipation of the heart and the soul, a freedom from fear, a freedom that can only come from love, a divine love. Pope Benedict mentions this story of Saint Bakita and her own life to couch the lesson that we can learn from hope. He explains to us that hope teaches us that our life will not end in emptiness, but that God has ultimately redeemed us and sought to communicate to us that there is a reason for why we're here on this earth. God wants us to know that our life is not meaningless, that he is beside us at all times in all difficulties, and with that knowledge, nothing can ever break us. Pope Benedict also makes the very important point that hope is not merely informative. That is to say, it's not merely a sentiment that can comfort us in the mind. Rather, it changes the entire way we live our life. And so he says that it's not merely informative, but it's also performative. Signs that we have lost hope may manifest themselves as having a difficulty getting out of bed or having a routine in our life where we're motivated not only by what we have to do next as if it's a chore, but why we're doing it. The purpose of our existence, to love God and to love our neighbor, is lost on us. And such a lifestyle leads to an emptiness that chills the soul from within. Jesus wants us to know that we have a purpose and a mission, that we are an important part of his providence, that he's calling us to a life of meaning. And so Pope Benedict explains that hope is inseparable from the virtue of faith, that faith in a way is our hope, that our relationship with God gives us our sense of meaning and identity and purpose. St. Paul, a man who was imprisoned in his life, experienced the lack of liberty politically. And yet in the prison cell, he was the most free of all. He was not controlled by the government's tactics of fear and coercion. He was not controlled by the political forms of coercion, even from religious elders who sought to stone him to death and finally end his life and demise. But rather, St. Paul was the freest because he said, "I boast of the cross of Christ." It's a statement that we, so removed from that time period, may not truly appreciate. But to say that I boast of the cross of Christ in a time when people were still being actively crucified was like saying, you think that you can control me. You think that you can threaten me with death. You think that you can threaten me with a crucifixion. But that's where I find my hope. In a way, he was effectively ripping the rug from underneath their feet, taking the ugliest thing that they upheld as a tool to control the masses. And he showed them that they had no control over him, that he was free. His will and his spirit would not be broken by all the persecutions and difficulties that he faced in his life. And that unbreakable spirit comes from the performative virtue or habit of hope, but a hope that's grounded not in any sentiment of worldly value, but rather is founded and rooted in the love of Jesus Christ and how he conquered death for our sake on the cross. Jesus himself gives us a good example of the virtue of hope. For he was on the cross, a place of great darkness and evil, and yet he's turned it into something of a sign of love and hope for all of us. Jesus reveals to us that he can take all of the world's most evil and dark situations and turn them into an opportunity for love and compassion and faith and redemption. And in that, nothing in this world can ever break us as Christians. No persecutions, no sickness, nothing can separate us from the love that God is offering us each and every day and moment of our life. Why is hope performative? It's very important to see that the theological virtues are always meant to be married to or connected to the cardinal virtues. As I mentioned before, the cardinal virtues are what make us good human beings, but the theological virtues make us good Christians. And all the virtues that are theological are connected to God. And so these aren't two separate realities of virtues where they all live on their own, but rather our prudence is informed and inflamed with the gift of faith, hope, and love, as is our courage, our temperance, and justice. So for example, Jesus, while he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, had the relationship with his Father in heaven. He knew that his Father was good, and so he surrendered to his Father's will, even though from a very natural and human point of view, he sought to be free from the death on the cross. But he surrendered to his Father because of the gift of trust that he had in his Father's own goodness, knowledge that God was good. Jesus also was prudent in doing the will of his Father and just, giving his Father credit where credit was due. And of course, Jesus was temperate in his approach as he was being persecuted. He didn't fly off the handle. Use all his divine powers to strike everyone dead, which he probably could have done walking away from the cross. He had walked on water. He had healed. He had performed so many miracles. And yet he knew this was the will of his Father. And he knew when to be silent and when to speak up. Jesus is a person who married those gifts of love and trust and, of course, hope in his Father. And he gives us that example for ourselves. Think of, if you will, the cardinal virtues are like arrows. That they're a simple instrument that we could use in a spiritual battle. But when you marry faith, hope, and love to them, they're like an arrow set on fire. Those virtues are elevated and lifted up to a divine reality. And so when Pope Benedict says that the virtue of hope is not merely informational, but it's performative, what he's teaching us is that it changes the whole way that we look at life. It changes what it means to be a human being into being a child and imitator of God's own love. It lifts us up to our true destiny. And that is what the theological virtues are all about. They're all about a totally new way of life that elevates the human race into heaven.